The floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse reflected Chicago's skyline like a crown of diamonds against the midnight sky. Emily Santos smoothed the crimson fabric over her hips for the third time that evening, her hands trembling slightly, not from excitement about her sister's quinceañera, but from the familiar weight of breaking the one rule that had kept her alive for 18 months. At 22, Emily had perfected the art of invisibility, moving through Michael Corleone's sprawling penthouse like a shadow in sensible shoes. She'd been working as his live-in maid for a year and a half now, grateful for a position that came with a roof over her head, 3 meals a day, and most importantly, anonymity in a city where the wrong person recognizing her face could mean death. The red dress hung against her olive skin like a declaration of war against everything she'd built. Isabella had sent it 2 weeks ago with a note written in their mother's careful script, "You deserve to be seen, Mija. Just for one night." Emily checked her reflection in the mirror one last time. The woman staring back looked nothing like the invisible maid who scrubbed marble countertops and kept her eyes on the floor. This woman looked alive. Dangerous. Like someone who belonged in the world her father had ruled before Mateo Vargas put a bullet in his head. "Just get to the service elevator," she whispered to herself, slipping her phone into the small clutch Isabella had included with the dress. 3 hours. Dance with your sister. Come back before he even knows you're gone. Before we continue, please subscribe. My mom says I won't get any subscriber, so please let's prove her wrong. Okay, let's get back into it. The penthouse was quiet, or as quiet as it ever got. Michael's office door was closed, yellow light bleeding underneath. He'd been in there since 7, taking calls in rapid-fire Sicilian that made the walls feel thin. Emily had learned to read the cadence of his voice over the past 18 months, the way a sailor reads the ocean. Tonight, he sounded tense. Distracted. Perfect. She slipped out of her small bedroom, barely larger than a walk-in closet, but it was hers, and it was safe, and started down the hallway toward the service entrance. The marble floors were cold beneath her heels, each click of her shoes echoing like a countdown. 10 more steps. 8. 5. Emily. The voice cut through the silence like a blade, sharp, commanding, with just a hint of something she'd never heard before. Something that made her spine straighten and her heart slam against her ribs. She turned slowly, carefully, trying to remember how to breathe. Michael Corleone stood in the hallway, his office door open behind him, papers still scattered across his desk in the warm light. He was tall, she'd always known that, but she'd never been this close to him while wearing heels that brought her almost to eye level. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as though he'd been running his hands through it, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms that spoke of a man who didn't just give orders but knew how to enforce them. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. Dark, calculating, Sicilian eyes that had never, not once in 18 months, truly looked at her. Until now. His gaze traveled from the red dress to her face, lingering on the cascade of dark hair she'd left loose instead of pulled back in the tight bun she wore while working. Something flickered across his features, surprise, maybe, or recognition, or something far more dangerous that made her stomach flutter inappropriately. "Where are you going dressed like that?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Emily didn't dare examine. His voice had dropped an octave, somewhere between anger and concern and something darker that made her pulse quicken. Emily swallowed hard, her rehearsed explanation dying on her lips. "My sister. It's her quinceañera. I was just going to. In that dress." It wasn't a question. Michael took a step closer, and Emily fought the urge to step back. In 18 months, they'd existed in the same space with careful distance, employer and employee, predator and prey pretending they didn't see each other. Now that distance had collapsed, and she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that made her think of old churches and older sins. It was a gift, she managed, hating how breathless she sounded. From my sister. I'll be back in 3 hours. You won't even know I always know where you are, Emily. His eyes held hers, and there was something in them now, something that made her wonder if invisibility had been an illusion all along. Every minute of every day for the past 18 months, I've known exactly where you are. The confession should have terrified her. Instead, it sent a different kind of chill down her spine. Michael's jaw tightened, and he pulled his phone from his pocket with one hand, never breaking eye contact. He pressed a single button and spoke in rapid Italian, 2 sentences, sharp and commanding, before ending the call. You're not going alone, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Emily's carefully constructed world began to crack, 18 months of silence pressing against the promise of one night of being herself. She opened her mouth to protest, to lie, to do whatever it took to maintain the facade that had kept her alive. But Michael Corleone was already looking at her the way a man looks at a secret he's been keeping, with dangerous recognition and something that might have been longing, if men like him were capable of such things. And Emily realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that invisibility had never been protection. It had been a cage. And tonight, dressed in red, she'd just rattled the bars. Emily's breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat as Michael took another step forward. The hallway had never felt this narrow, this suffocating. In 18 months, she'd mapped every inch of this penthouse, knew which floorboards creaked and which corners offered the best shadows. Now it felt like foreign territory, transformed by the way he was looking at her, really looking at her, for the first time. It's just a family thing, she managed, the words coming out softer than she intended. She tried to step around him, angling toward the service entrance like she could somehow slip past 6 feet of Sicilian muscle and suspicion. Nothing important. I'll be back before. Michael moved with the efficient grace of a man who'd spent his life calculating angles and cutting off exits. One step to the left, and suddenly her path was blocked. Not aggressively, he didn't touch her, didn't crowd her space, but the message was unmistakable. She wasn't leaving until he decided she could. Which family event? His voice remained calm, almost conversational, but Emily had spent enough time in this penthouse to recognize the steel underneath. This was the voice he used before someone disappeared from his organization chart. Her mind raced through the lie she'd rehearsed. Simple. Believable. The kind of excuse that wouldn't raise questions. My cousin. It's her birthday. Just dinner, really. Very low-key. The words tumbled out with practiced ease, and she even managed to meet his eyes for half a second before looking away. That half-second was her mistake. Michael's gaze sharpened, tracking the nervous flutter of her hands against the red fabric, the way her eyes fixed on the point just past his shoulder rather than his face. She'd learned long ago that liars who maintained too much eye contact were just as suspicious as those who maintained too little. The key was the middle ground, brief, natural glances that suggested honesty without performance. But Michael Corleone hadn't built an empire by missing tells. A cousin's birthday, he repeated slowly, as if tasting the words for poison. He stepped back, just one step, but instead of relief, Emily felt dread pull in her stomach. Because he wasn't moving aside. He was simply giving himself space to make a decision. His phone appeared in his hand with the smooth efficiency of a magic trick. He pressed a single contact and lifted it to his ear, his eyes never leaving her face. When someone answered, he spoke in rapid Italian, the Sicilian dialect that she'd heard bleeding through his office door 1,000 times but never directed at her. The words came too fast for her limited Italian, but she caught fragments. A location. A time. Instructions delivered with the expectation of absolute obedience. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs as Michael ended the call with a single decisive tap. The silence that followed felt alive, crackling with unspoken questions and dangerous truths neither of them could afford to acknowledge. "You're not going alone." The words landed like a verdict. Final. Non-negotiable. "I don't need," Emily started, finding her voice somewhere in the panic rising through her chest. "This is my personal life. I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly capable of." "You think I don't know who you are, Emily Santos?" Her real name. Her father's name. Spoken in that Sicilian accent that turned the soft vowels into something between a caress and a threat. The sound detonated between them like a grenade, and Emily felt the carefully constructed walls of 18 months crumble into dust. The hallway tilted. Or maybe she did. Her hand found the wall behind her, fingers pressing against cool plaster as if it could anchor her to reality. "I don't know what you're." "Don't." Michael's voice cut through her denial with surgical precision. "Don't insult both of us by pretending. I've known for 4 months. Ever since one of Mateo Vargas's informants started circulating your photo through the family networks. He said Vargas's name like it tasted bitter. Asking questions. Very specific questions about a Colombian girl who disappeared after her father's funeral." Emily's vision narrowed to pinpricks. 4 months. He'd known for 4 months and said nothing. Every morning she'd brought him coffee, every evening she'd cleaned his office while he worked late, every careful nod and yes, sir and averted gaze, all of it performed under the weight of a truth he'd been carrying the entire time. "Why?" The word came out broken, barely a whisper. "Why didn't you?" "Because you were safer here." Michael's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in his eyes, something that might have been understanding if she hadn't known better. Hidden in plain sight. One more anonymous employee in a building full of them. Vargas's men were watching the universities, the hospitals, the churches. They were tracking anyone who fit your profile, applying for jobs that required documentation. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped. "They never thought to look at my household staff." The logic was flawless and terrifying. Emily had spent 18 months congratulating herself on her cleverness, on finding the perfect hiding place in the least likely location. But it had never been her plan. It had been his protection, wrapped in the illusion of employment, and she'd been too desperate to question why a man like Michael Corleone would hire a maid with minimal references and a work permit that barely passed scrutiny. "You've been watching me," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I've been keeping you alive," Michael corrected. His phone buzzed once in his hand, and he glanced at the screen before looking back at her with something that might have been resignation. "And tonight, Emily Santos, you decided to paint a target on your back and walk out my door wearing red." Something inside Emily snapped. 18 months of swallowed words, of biting her tongue, of shrinking herself into shadows, all of it erupted in a surge of rage so powerful it burned through her fear. "Why?" Her voice shook, but not with terror anymore. "If you've known all this time, why help me? Men like you don't do anything without a reason." For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then his expression shifted into something brutally honest, almost raw. "Because men like Vargas destroy everything beautiful. They take what doesn't belong to them and twist it into something ugly just because they can." He took a breath, and his next words came quieter, weighted with something Emily couldn't name. "And you, Emily, deserve better than being collateral damage in his rise to power." The confession hung between them, too intimate for employer and employee, too dangerous for strangers hiding in the same space. Emily felt something crack inside her chest, but she couldn't afford to examine it. Not now. Not when Isabella was waiting, when this one night, the only night Emily had allowed herself in 18 months, was slipping away. "I'm going." The words came out steady, stronger than she felt. "Isabella doesn't know what happened to Papa. She thinks he died in a car accident. Tonight is her night, and I won't let Vargas steal that from her too." Michael studied her for a long moment, and Emily braced herself for the argument, the command, the cold refusal. Instead, he pulled a phone from his pocket, not his usual device, but something smaller, simpler. "Then we make a deal." Emily's fingers closed around the phone he pressed into her palm. It was warm from his pocket, the screen showing only one contact. "No name. Just a number." "Two of my men will be stationed outside the venue," Michael said, his tone shifting back into the calculating efficiency she recognized. "You keep this phone on you. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you press that number. I'll have you out of there in 3 minutes." Emily nodded, not trusting her voice. She started toward the service entrance again, and this time Michael didn't stop her. But as her hand touched the elevator button, his voice reached her one more time. "Red makes you visible, Emily." She turned back, finding him still standing in that same spot, backlit by the warm glow from his office. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Tonight," he said quietly, "that might be dangerous." The elevator doors opened, and Emily stepped inside, her reflection in the polished steel showing a woman in crimson who'd just been seen, truly seen, for the first time in 18 months. The community center smelled like her childhood, arroz con pollo, fresh flowers, and the vanilla jasmine perfume her mother had worn for as long as Emily could remember. Cumbia music pulsed through speakers that crackled slightly on the high notes, and the small dance floor was already crowded with aunts and cousins and family friends who'd watched Isabella grow up. Emily stood in the doorway for a moment, drinking it in. The papal picado banners strung across the ceiling, the tiered cake crowned with a tiny tiara, the pink and gold balloons clustered in every corner. And there, in the center of it all, was Isabella, 15 and radiant in a pink gown that made her look like she'd stepped out of a fairy tale. "Mija." Her mother's voice cracked with emotion as she pulled Emily into a fierce embrace. "You came. I was so worried you couldn't get away." Emily held her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of her mother's hair. "I wouldn't miss this for anything." For 2 hours, Emily let herself forget. She danced merengue with her mother, taught Isabella's friends the steps her father had taught her years ago, and laughed until her cheeks hurt. The phone Michael had given her sat heavy in her clutch, but she ignored it, lost in the joy of being Emily Santos again instead of Emily Reyes, the invisible maid. Isabella grabbed her hands, spinning her in a circle, her face glowing with happiness. "I knew you'd wear it. You look like a movie star, Em. Like you could do anything." Emily's throat tightened. "You're the star tonight, Hermanita." But as Isabella twirled away to dance with their cousin, Emily's gaze swept the room, a habit she couldn't break, even here. And that's when she saw him. A man leaning against the far wall near the refreshment table, nursing a beer he hadn't touched. 30-something, leather jacket, eyes too sharp and focused for a casual guest. But it was the tattoo crawling up his neck that made Emily's blood turn to ice, 3 interlocking serpents, their tails forming a triangle. Vargas's mark. The symbol his enforcers wore like a uniform. The music didn't stop, but Emily couldn't hear it anymore. Her pulse thundered in her ears as the man's gaze locked onto hers across the crowded room. He didn't smile. Didn't move. Just watched her with the cold calculation of a predator who'd finally found his prey. Emily forced herself to breathe, to move naturally as she crossed to where Isabella was laughing with their mother. She pulled her sister into a tight embrace, pressing her lips close to Isabella's ear. "I love you so much." Never forget that. Then, over Isabella's shoulder, she caught her mother's eye and saw the exact moment understanding dawned. Her mother had lived in Ricardo Santos's world long enough to recognize danger when it walked through the door. Emily mouthed 2 words, emergency plan. Her mother's face went pale, but she nodded once, sharp and decisive, already reaching for Isabella's hand. Emily turned toward the kitchen, moving quickly but not running. Running would draw attention, and Vargas's scout was still watching from across the room. The kitchen exit led to an alley that emptied onto a side street. If she could just make it there, disappear into the Chicago night before he radioed for backup. She pushed through the swinging door, past the catering staff arranging empanadas on serving trays, and burst into the alley. The cool night air hit her face like a slap, and for one desperate second, she thought she'd made it. Then she saw them. 2 more men blocking the alley exit. Both wearing leather jackets. Both with that same cold, predatory stillness that marked them as professionals. The one on the left had the serpent tattoo visible above his collar. Emily's hand dove into her clutch, fingers fumbling for the phone Michael had given her. She typed 3 words with shaking hands, "They found me." The men started toward her, boots scraping against concrete. They were speaking in Spanish now, low voices that carried clearly in the narrow alley. Vargas said, "Alive, right?" The taller one grinned, revealing a gold tooth. "Didn't say anything about undamaged." "She's pretty in that dress," the other one agreed, his gaze sliding over her in a way that made Emily's skin crawl. Shame to waste the opportunity. Vargas doesn't need to know everything. Emily backed toward the kitchen door, but it had locked behind her. Her shoulder blades hit brick. Trapped. The first man reached for her, his hand closing around her wrist. Gunshots cracked through the night like thunder. Emily flinched, her free hand flying up to protect her head, but the bullets weren't aimed at her. The streetlight above exploded in a shower of sparks and glass. Then the next one. Then the next, plunging the alley into near-total darkness. Tires screamed against asphalt. A black SUV, no plates, windows tinted dark, screeched to a halt at the mouth of the alley, its headlights cutting through the sudden darkness like searchlights. Doors flew open. Men poured out, 4, 5, 6 of them, moving with military precision. They wore dark suits and carried weapons with the casual confidence of people who knew how to use them. They formed a wall between Emily and Vargas's scouts, a human barrier of Sicilian muscle and cold intent. And then Michael stepped out of the SUV. He didn't run. Didn't rush. Just walked into the alley with the kind of calm that was somehow more terrifying than violence, his eyes finding Emily in the darkness with unerring accuracy. His jacket was open, and she could see the shoulder holster beneath, the dark metal of a gun catching the SUV's headlights. "Emily." His voice cut through the chaos, steady and absolute. "Come here. Now." Her legs moved before her brain caught up, carrying her forward on instinct. Michael's hand closed around her arm, firm but gentle, pulling her past his men and into the SUV. The door slammed shut behind them, muffling the shouted threats and the sound of fists meeting flesh as his crew dealt with Vargas's scouts. The SUV lurched forward, tires screaming as they peeled away from the community center. Emily's hands were shaking so violently she couldn't hold on to the phone anymore. It clattered to the floor, and suddenly the adrenaline drained out of her all at once, leaving nothing but the crushing weight of 18 months of fear she'd been carrying alone. She broke. The sobs came in racking waves, her entire body trembling as grief, terror, and exhaustion poured out in a flood she couldn't control. Her father's face, the funeral she'd watched from a distance, Isabella's childhood stolen, her mother's haunted eyes, all of it crashed over her at once. "I'm sorry," she gasped between sobs. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have, I put everyone in danger." Michael's fortress-like composure cracked. He pulled her against his chest without hesitation, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other wrapped around her shoulders. "You're safe," he said, his voice rough with something Emily had never heard before. "I swear to you, you're safe." She pressed her face against his shirt, breathing in cologne and gunpowder, and let herself shatter in the arms of a man who'd been protecting her from shadows she hadn't even known were hunting her. The penthouse felt different when they returned, no longer a cage, but a fortress. Michael guided her to the living room, and for the first time in 18 months, Emily sat on his furniture instead of cleaning it. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, pressing one into her trembling hands. "Vargas has been systematic," Michael said, settling into the chair across from her. "Your father's lieutenants, his accountants, his lawyer, all dead within 6 months of his assassination. Heart attacks. Car accidents. One very unfortunate mugging." His jaw tightened. "Vargas's cleaning house. And you, Emily, are the last living link to approximately $40 million in offshore accounts your father kept separate from cartel operations." Emily's fingers tightened around the glass. "It's not about the money." "No? He knows I have something more valuable than money." Emily set down her whiskey with shaking hands and stood, walking to the hallway that led to her small room. When she returned, she was holding something that looked like a simple thumb drive. 3 weeks before my father died, I was in his office. Vargas didn't know I was there. I was supposed to be at university. But I heard everything." Michael's eyes sharpened. "Everything?" "His confession. How he planned it. Why he did it. How much he enjoyed my father's trust." Emily's voice steadied as fury overtook fear. "I recorded it all on my phone. Had it encrypted and transferred before I ran. I've kept it sewn into the lining of my uniform ever since." She held up the drive. "This is why Vargas will never stop looking for me." Michael's gaze locked onto the thumb drive in her hand, then lifted slowly to her face. Something shifted in his expression, respect, maybe, or recognition of a truth he'd missed. "You haven't been running," he said quietly. "You've been waiting. For the right moment. The right opportunity." Emily's fingers closed around the drive. "For someone powerful enough to help me use this without getting us both killed." A slow smile curved Michael's mouth, dangerous and admiring. "Then let's give Vargas exactly what he deserves." He stood, moving to the windows overlooking Chicago's glittering skyline, his mind already working through angles and strategies. "We leak his operations. Not just to the DEA, they're too slow, too bureaucratic. We feed it to his rivals. The Mexican cartels he's been undercutting. The Russian syndicate he's been stealing territory from. Create chaos," Emily said, understanding dawning. "Create a war." Michael turned back to her, and his eyes gleamed with cold calculation. "When everyone's hunting him, when he's fighting on 6 fronts at once, that's when he makes mistakes. That's when we bring him the evidence and let him hang himself." Emily's heart hammered against her ribs, but not from fear this time. This was what she'd been waiting for, a real chance at justice, at ending Vargas before he could destroy anyone else. But the reality settled over her like ice water. "This isn't your fight, Michael. If you do this, if you go against Vargas openly, you'll be declaring war on a Colombian cartel. The risk. You stopped being just my maid the moment you wore that red dress." The words cut through her protest, raw and absolute. Michael crossed back to her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. "You became someone I protect. He stopped himself, jaw tightening as if he'd almost said something dangerous. "This is my fight now, Emily. Because you're mine to protect. The admission hung between them, electric and charged with feelings neither could afford to name. Not yet. Not while Vargas was still hunting her. But Emily felt it anyway, the shift from employer to ally, from distant stranger to something far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. "Tell me about him," Michael said, his voice dropping back into tactical efficiency even as his eyes remained intense on hers. "His patterns. His paranoia. Everything you remember from your father's world." Emily took a breath and began. She told him about Vargas's obsession with loyalty tests, his tendency to meet in public places where he felt safer, his paranoia about electronic communication. Michael listened, asking sharp questions, building a profile of a man whose greatest strength, his suspicion, could become his fatal weakness. They worked through the night, Emily's insider knowledge weaving together with Michael's resources and tactical expertise. Plans formed and reformed, contingencies layered upon contingencies. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, Emily realized they'd stopped being two people hiding in the same space and become something else entirely. Partners. Allies. And maybe, when this was over, something neither of them had dared hope for. 2 weeks later, Emily walked into El Corazon wearing red. The Colombian restaurant sat on a corner in Pilsen, its windows steamed from the kitchen and its walls covered in faded photographs of Bogotá. Her father had conducted business here every Thursday for 10 years, always at the corner booth where he could see both entrances. The owner had been loyal to Ricardo Santos. Which meant Vargas had eyes here too. Emily slid into that same corner booth, ordered a guardian she wouldn't drink, and waited. She didn't have to wait long. The door opened, and Mateo Vargas walked in like he owned the place, because he did now, owned this restaurant and a dozen others, owned territories and trafficking routes and the loyalty bought with her father's blood money. 6 armed men flanked him, hands resting casually near concealed weapons. But it was Vargas's smile that made Emily's stomach turn, predatory and triumphant, the smile of a man who thought he'd already won. "Ricardo's little girl," he said in Spanish, sliding into the booth across from her. "All grown up. And wearing red, no less. Your father always said you had his fire." Emily stood slowly, her hands steady despite her racing heart. "My father trusted you. He called you brother." Her voice carried through the restaurant, clear and unwavering. "He gave you everything, his loyalty, his protection, his secrets. And you murdered him for it." Vargas's smile widened. "Business, Mija. Your father was getting soft. Talking about retirement, about going legitimate." He leaned back, confident. "I did what was necessary." "I know." Emily placed a small recording device on the table between them. "I've always known." She pressed play. Vargas's voice filled the restaurant, younger but unmistakable, discussing the poisoning with his lieutenant. The exact dosage. The timeline. And then, worst of all, laughter, genuine, delighted laughter about how easy it had been to deceive Ricardo Santos, how the old man had died thinking his brother was holding his hand. Vargas's hand shot toward his jacket, reaching for his gun. The kitchen doors exploded open. FBI agents poured through, weapons drawn, shouting commands in English and Spanish. The front entrance erupted with Michael's men, forming an impenetrable wall. And through the bathroom corridor came men Emily recognized from her father's old photographs, Mexican cartel leaders, Russian syndicate representatives, all the rivals Vargas had crossed, all waiting for proof of his betrayal. Michael appeared at Emily's side as if materialized from shadows, his hand settling at the small of her back. "It's over," he said quietly. Vargas lunged across the table, but Michael's other hand was already moving, his gun pressed against Vargas's temple before he could reach Emily. "Down. Now." The restaurant erupted into controlled chaos, FBI agents taking Vargas's men into custody, rival cartel members watching with cold satisfaction, evidence being catalogued and secured. And through it all, Emily stood tall in her red dress, no longer hiding, no longer running. Finally free. 8 months later, Emily stood on the balcony of the penthouse wearing red, not out of defiance this time, but because she simply wanted to. Below her, Chicago glittered like scattered diamonds against velvet darkness, a city that had witnessed her transformation from hiding to reclaiming everything her father had built. Santos Import-Export had risen from the ashes of her father's empire, scrubbed clean of cartel connections and rebuilt as something legitimate. Emily had taken the helm with Michael as her partner and advisor, their names appearing side by side on contracts and business filings. The offshore accounts had funded the transition, and the legitimate businesses her father had always dreamed of finally existed without the shadow of blood money. The sliding door whispered open behind her, and Michael's presence filled the space with familiar warmth. His arm slid around her waist with the ease born of trust and time, pulling her back against his chest. She felt his breath against her temple, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat at her back. "You know," he said, his voice carrying that rare softness he reserved only for her, "I never answered your question from that first night." Emily turned in his arms, tilting her head back to study his face in the ambient glow of the city lights. "What question?" "Where I thought you were going, dressed like that." His smile was genuine, transforming his features from dangerous to devastating. "When I saw you in the hallway in that red dress, for one terrible moment, I thought you were walking out of my life. And I realized," he paused, his hand coming up to cup her face with unexpected gentleness. "I couldn't allow it. Not then. Not ever." Emily's heart swelled with something too vast to name, though she knew what it was. Had known since that night in the alley when he'd materialized from darkness like a guardian fashioned from shadows and steel. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Except wherever you are." Michael kissed her then, slow and thorough, tasting of whiskey and promises kept. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, and they stood there together on the balcony of what was no longer just his penthouse but their shared home. Below them, Chicago pulsed with endless possibility, a city where a Colombian cartel princess and a Sicilian mafia boss had forged something neither had expected. Not just a partnership of equals or a business alliance, but love born from danger, tempered by trust, and strengthened by the choice to stand together against whatever came next. Emily Santos no longer needed to hide who she was. She wore her father's name with pride, managed his legitimate legacy with skill, and loved a dangerous man who'd seen her when she was trying hardest to disappear. She wore red whenever she chose now, bold, visible, unafraid. And Michael? He'd learned that true power wasn't about control or dominance. It was about standing beside someone brave enough to face the world in crimson, and trusting her to stand beside you in return. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling stories. Your comments mean the world to me. Let me know what you thought and what kind of stories you'd like to see next. Until next time, keep watching and stay mysterious.